topic is navigating the pandemic. We are still going through it, so we are still navigating it, and the tightrope walk that not only healthcare sector, all sectors and all citizens are actually doing at this point. We will talk about that. If we reflect a minute about how we came to this situation, that it was late last year, maybe early December, when we all read about this new virus which is impacting parts of China, particularly the Wuhan territory. And a lot of us saw videos from there. A lot of us saw videos of the panic and hospitals getting overrun in December. It still appeared very remote to us, and we there were a lot of flippant comments about how the virus happened, and comments about the Chinese in general and all that. All of us thought, at least many parts of the world thought that this would remain confined to China and maybe to that territory, and none of us would ever have to deal with it. Then in late January, I think on 30th January, maybe the first case in India came through. A student who returned from China to Kerala was the first case, if I recall right. And then it started slowly growing. And by end of March, we had come to a situation where the country had to be locked down. So from December, around Christmas, when we all felt safe and that this is happening somewhere else in the world and we are safe, and we were thinking about the way ahead in as a normal period ahead of us in India. 3 months later, we had maybe the first shutdown that as a country that we ever had to take. Even in people who remember the wars that we had with China and Pakistan in the past, would never recall a shutdown of the kind that we had to do. So that's how it started. When the virus actually started growing in India in March, there was very little idea about what it is doing, apart from knowing that it's a highly infectious virus. Infectivity rates were very high. Doctors were not very clear as to what is to be done because it was a novel virus. We call it a novel coronavirus. Novel would mean a new virus. So therefore, there's no history, no playbook available about how to deal with it. And it was uncertain how this virus would impact us as human beings, what organ system would get impacted, and how it would go through this cycle. There was very little idea. Even now, I think there is not completely clarity on this, but maybe 4 or 5 months into this, most countries have figured out some way of tackling it. So, the context was an unknown enemy to speak, and an unknown enemy that created confusion, created panic, and invited unprecedented kind of response from world over, and the enemy who really was not susceptible to most weapons available at that point of time. So this is the context that we felt. Now, if we look at hospitals, specifically, I would want to, since many of us belong to that sector, I would want to talk about this pandemic in terms of hospitals or healthcare delivery systems. Let's first talk about the first item on the list, that how it impacted the business or the enterprise. The very first thing that happened was the fear factor, that people was even now, large segments of our population are terrified of the virus. And in late March, when the country shut down, there was even more panic than what we are facing today. So there was great fear factor, and that fear factor impacted not only healthcare business; it impacted every segment of the economy in India. And for the hospitals, it translated to significant reduction in people visiting hospitals, whether in outpatients or inpatient for admissions. Massive drop of people visiting hospitals. To give an example of where I work, in the Manipal system, we pre-COVID used to see about 4,500 to 5,000 patients in the OPD in a day across the network. It came down to maybe about 500 or 600 OPDs per day, in March, late March and most of April. That's about one tenth, about 10 or 15% of the normal traffic that you would end up seeing. So, what we should keep in mind is that the low footfalls at the hospital does not mean people out in the society are not sick. The sickness continues, but then there was great reluctance to visit a hospital out of fear of contracting the virus. If you look at inpatient admissions, again, people refuse to get admitted. Even in extreme circumstances, it required a lot of convincing for somebody to get admitted to a hospital. So even again, to quote a statistic, again in the Manipal context, which is similar for most other hospital groups in the country, from occupancies of about 70% at a network level, occupancy came down to about 25 or 28% in March and April. So both outpatients and inpatients sort of suffered a dramatic collapse across the network. Not only in our context, it would have been same across all parts of India, whether it's a large corporate hospital group or a standalone hospital or a nursing home. I think this is something which is severely impacted. Uh, there were postponement of all kinds of elective work, anything where the patient had a little choice that I can do it after a month or 2 months. It was automatically that choice was exercised. So elective work, whether it's it is orthopedic surgeries, neurosurgeries, cardiac procedures, and across the spectrum of specialities, elective work suffered a huge collapse. And there was also a migration to single specialty modes that people who otherwise used to come to multi-specialty hospital, for example, obstetrics work, people migrated to single specialty standalone hospitals, thinking that it is safer than going to a multi-specialty environment. So all of this is what impacted the enterprise, again in the context of healthcare delivery. To recap, the fear factor leading to a huge dip in the footfall, and it also forcing people to decide to postpone treatments, and a structural change to some extent where single specialty hospitals saw some migration into those systems from multi-specialty hospitals. So this is the first thing to keep in mind, how the pandemic impacted the hospital enterprise. If you think outside of the healthcare delivery systems, impact would have been even more severe. If you look at airlines, if you look at hotels or restaurants, lot of other service industries, when the lockdown put a hold to anybody venturing out, any travel, a lot of industries collapsed. Actually, collapse is the word to use. There are a lot of job losses, particularly in service industries. So while healthcare had this impact, and we still had some patients coming to us, outside of healthcare, there was dramatic impact, especially on the service industry, and consequently losses in jobs. Now, if you look at the point number two in this list of what impacted hospitals in particular, uh, the second impact was on the operations, the basic hospital operations that we all handle. The first one would be new processes that arose out of the requirement for social distancing. So, of course, the extra cycles of cleaning, extra cycles of checking patients and visitors at various points of entry and exit. Of course, the use of PPEs, the donning and doffing issues around that, and effective capacities came down. That in the past, social distancing also meant that effective capacities came down. The number of people that we can hold within the hospital at any point of time in an OPD, which may have had say 50 seats, currently, with social distancing, that capacity then comes down to 30 come down to about one third of it. So then the OPD scheduling gets affected. Uh, the time that a doctor needs to spend preparing for the next patient, again from sanitizing and all that perspective, the number of patients that a doctor can see in an hour dramatically came down. The number of tests that you can do, particularly in areas like radiology or echocardiography, sonography kind of areas, CT, MR kind of areas, X-rays, that dramatically came down. The requirement of new inventory went up. Inventory of sanitizers, inventory of medicines and drugs considered to be useful for treatment of COVID, inventory of gloves and masks and PPE suits went up. And whereas the existing inventory, which was set up for a normal operation, became substantially over requirement. Inventories which were for 30 days or of that order pre-COVID automatically became inventory of 90 days or 120 days because the volumes actually came down, as I explained earlier. So these things, these change in the new processes, reduction in capacity, the increase in inventory, the increased cost of ensuring safety, all at least the the people in this group who work in hospitals know in the last 4 or 5 months what has been the increase in safety and the cost of that. Not only in hospitals, the safety measures which are now put in, even in a small restaurant or a grocery shop, the cost of implementing those is again an impact that we have to consider. So, in addition to the first point that I talked about, how COVID impacted enterprises, how COVID impacted operations and therefore cost of operations is the point number two that we need to keep in mind. Another important thing I would want to submit to your consideration is genuinely the plight of non-COVID patients. In the last 5 months, the whole country, the whole healthcare system is tied down to treating COVID, which is fair. But imagine what is happening to the non-COVID patients. There is a significant reluctance, like I said even earlier, significant reluctance in non-COVID patients to approach hospitals or doctors for treatment. This is actually causing disease progression. People who could have been helped are going beyond help. So, people who have cancer, early stage cancer, maybe other early stage diseases which could have been stopped from progression, are now getting impacted because of two or three issues. One is the fear, and maybe slowly people are overcoming that. Secondly, the logistics are still suffering. That people from without app, without full-fledged transport systems being back, particularly trains, a lot of people are finding it difficult to access healthcare. And if you all recall, hospitals which are flagship, Care Banjara for an example, Manipal Airport Road in Bangalore for an example, Manipal Delhi for example, these are hospitals which cater to regions. Uh, and my colleagues, former colleagues from Care would remember that, in our hospital at Care Banjara, maybe about 50-55% of the patients came from outside of Hyderabad. If you recall, Dr. Somraju and his colleagues in ACA used to get a lot of patients from the Godavari district, both East and West Godavari districts, other parts of the state. So without transport, there is even now, fifth month into the pandemic, even now there is a significant lack of access for patients to come to hospitals. So this is causing disease progression. To quote a statistic, India does across the country in private and public sector put together. India does about 750 kidney transplants a month. That is 750 transplants a month. In the month of April, the first month of lockdown, this came down to 20 transplants a month. Even now, in July and August, it is still below 100. So it is not as if the kidney patients or the renal, the morbidity numbers have gone down. is just that these high-end work, these life-saving work is just not happening. So there are people suffering. So if you look at the cycles of chemotherapy, which used to happen earlier, the cycles of radiation therapy, which used to happen earlier, which are life-saving, it's still well below the pre-COVID levels. So what we also need to keep in mind is the significant impact on the non-COVID patients. The fourth point that we should reflect on in the context of pandemic is the regulatory interventions which have happened. Right, all of us know that government had intervened. Everybody was caught off guard, so we really can't blame the government. This was again a unique situation in that sense, which got the country. Uh, but then the public sector, the government sector just could not handle uh, the requirements for hospital beds or treatment. What we should keep in mind is out of about 14 or 15 lakh hospital beds in the country, nearly 60% is with the private sector, which is private corporates or private charitable kind of hospitals. The government had only less than half of the total hospital beds in the country. And if you look at the high-end specialists, both doctors and also the technology, about 70% of that is still concentrated in the private sector. So when the pandemic hit, all the state governments, because health is a state government, and the center in particular was sort of caught off guard. And that gave rise to a lot of sudden regulatory interventions, saying that 50% of the beds or 60% of the beds would need to be reserved for treating COVID patients. There was actually a directive from Mumbai, a municipal corporation, requisitioning doctors, commandeering doctors to treat COVID. There were government regulations about how much you can charge for COVID treatment. So all of this regulatory intervention actually happened in a vacuum because there was not enough knowledge about the disease. For example, how do you fix a tariff for treating COVID if you really don't know what is the care pathway of treating COVID? Right? Many of this regulatory uh, caps on pricing came in early April or late April. And by the time the doctors across the country were not even certain what is the way to treat a COVID patient, what is the care pathway that we talk about. So without understanding that, people had fixed the prices. So that did not have a lot of clarity. And if you look at across the country, different states have different tariffs, different inclusions, different exclusions. What is included in the tariff? What is a treatment considered in the tariff? So this gave rise to a lot of confusion. Then, like I said, uh, the mechanism of reserving beds in the private sector, while private sector was really happy to participate, the way it went about the regulatory mechanisms, regulatory agencies went about handling this requirement left a lot to be desired. Uh, then the other part of the regulatory interventions also uh, was around the treatment protocols. Even now, different states have different treatment protocols. Home quarantine is not uniformly allowed. Some states still don't allow home quarantine. So the third impact of the pandemic was regulatory interventions, which was scattered, which was not really thought through, and which at the end I'm not very sure how much it helped the patients. And if you look at the reason for the regulatory interventions, there are states which have handled it well. Kerala, for an example, even today, every patient who's been diagnosed with COVID in Kerala has been treated in a private hospital and in a public hospital by the government free of charge. But less developed states where the public health infrastructure is still not good, is still suffering. So the regulatory intervention actually arose from the fact that India as a country had underinvested in healthcare for a long, long time. Uh, even as an objective, some years ago, the government of India had said about 2.5% of the GDP would be spent as the public investment in the healthcare sector. But even now, it's less than 1.2%, and most of that money goes into paying salaries. So therefore, the sector, the healthcare sector in general was sort of ignored for the last many decades over the many governments and many parties. It got ignored for the last many decades. The way we built airports or roads and highways and electricity transmission infrastructure, healthcare never found that priority, and therefore the unequal availability of infrastructure of a high order, that actually gave rise to all these regulatory interventions, and maybe a somewhat confrontationist environment in the beginning, where the insurance and private hospital sector and the government sector all were a little out of sync. So this is the fourth element that we need to keep in mind. The fifth thing is the adverse PR environment. The public relations actually in the first 2 or 3 months was really adverse. The I think maybe a lot of panic was created in some sense, by in a close group. In this close group, and not to quote outside, I'm saying I'm not very sure what is the role that media played in helping to handle the pandemic, whether it was proactive, whether it was a calming influence on the patients, or whether it fueled anxiety, is something we need to reflect on. But my own view is the media i- actually could have done a much better job in a situation like this, where lakhs of people are affected. There are bound to be examples where things did not go very well, and I don't know whether focusing on that alone was very conducive in helping to handle the pandemic. But that is something we need to keep in mind in a situation like this, whether the media and the health sector and the government, everybody could have come together and played a more constructive role, is something we should wonder about. And let's also keep in mind, this would not be the last pandemic. In the last 20 years, this is the fourth pandemic. Maybe COVID is largest in its scale, but there would be many more such instances which will happen over the next 50 or 100 years. So this is actually a wake-up call for not only our country, for the world over, to think about how do you handle a situation like this. And in that, we also need to keep in mind the proportion. While this has been a major event, unprecedented event, received wide coverage and created a lot of panic. We should also keep in mind the death toll in India is about 45,000 at the moment. About 2% of the total infected people. To We should also contrast gastroenteritis kills about 3 lakh people in India every year. So that is something we need to keep the context in our mind, that while COVID may end up killing maybe 100,000 people, 150,000 people in the country. Gastroenteritis kills 3 lakh people every year. So the preoccupation with this pandemic, while it is important, I'll come back to the earlier point that it has to be in the complete context, the suffering of the non-pandemic, non-COVID kind of patients, the ability for the economy to recover from the situation, and the larger economic context in which we need to handle pandemics of this kind. Now, the sixth point that I would want to talk about is effect on financials, particularly of a hospital. Since we are talking about healthcare context in particular, uh, if you recall, many of us working in the hospital sector, if you recall, about 70% of our cost of running a hospital is fixed, which is basically the cost of our doctors, cost of our associates who are on the payroll, our outsourced people, housekeeping and security, kind of people who are typically there, the rent of the building where the hospitals function, the maintenance contract for our medical equipment. The other way to think about the cost which is variable in running a hospital is primarily the consumables, the drugs and other consumables that we use, and maybe to some extent part of electricity and water. So when revenues dramatically come down, I mentioned in the first point that OPD footfalls came down to 10 or 15% of the normal, and inpatient became about one third of the normal in terms of occupancy. To give a example of Manipal network, pre-COVID, we used to do about 200 crores of revenue a month. In the first month of COVID, in April, that came down to 71 crores. It became one third, which is not surprising because that is in line with the footfall that we talked about. But when 200 crore revenue comes down to one third to 70 crores, and the cost, bulk of the cost remains fixed, obviously there would be a severe stress. I know you don't have to do too much of arithmetic around it, but you would certainly figure out there is a severe stress. And the hospitals, not only Manipal, and many of the listed hospitals have already published their Q1 results. But then most hospitals suffered severely in terms of cash losses in the quarter one, or particularly in April and May. So what has happened is, while larger hospital groups, say a Manipal or a Care or an Apollo or a Fortis, and hospitals of that kind would have reserves to overcome these losses for some months. Maybe we all would have cash enough for 6 or 8 months to survive. Many of the smaller hospitals, standalone hospital, nursing homes, just do not have that support. So, in a situation where every hospital bed in the country was required, many hospitals actually ended up closing down. And if we reflect on the cities and towns that we live in, we could have come across smaller, it may not be large hospitals, but smaller hospitals and nursing homes which have actually closed down on account of the pandemic. The way we have seen restaurants and hotels and other enterprises closing down, hospitals have also closed down. So this is a little counterintuitive because many people even now believe that a pandemic is good for healthcare, good for hospitals, and in the context of COVID, it just proved to be completely the opposite. For the reason that we discussed earlier, it completely ensured that all non-COVID patients don't access treatment. So, contrary to conventional wisdom that when people fall sick, when there is a pandemic, hospitals do well, it is completely reversed in this current situation. And if you read up the financial results which are published in the papers in the last 3 or 4 days, NH has published, Fortis has published, Aster has published, you would find people have made cash losses, significant cash losses in the first quarter. Now, the impact of cash losses are two or three. One is that when we don't generate cash to sustain our operations, we end up tightening our belts. The first thing that we do is we don't pay our vendors on time. That is, people who supply us stuff, whether it is an outsourced contractor, whether it's a chap from whom we buy our medicines or gloves or surgical sutures and all that, or people who supply us water, or people who supply us food. So what we do when we say tightening of the belt in a cash flow crunch situation is that we delay the payments. So in that, what happens is the larger people tend to get paid because they have more leverage with us to get their money, but the smaller enterprises, the mom and pop shops, the local players actually get impacted, and which in turn affects many very many people. For example, if we don't pay our housekeeping and security people on time, the contractors on time, their option is only to lay off people and lay off the our housekeeping and security staff, which very quickly would mean that many families actually end up in poverty because this is the only income that they have. The earning member is a security guard, the earning member is a housekeeping employee, and if they get laid off, that actually cascades the cash flow problems much outside of the hospital that we are talking about. So, effect on financials and cash flows. So, one is delaying the payments and the negative impact that it has. Some hospitals have absorbed a pay cut. For example, I have taken a 25% pay cut along with my senior colleagues, and our doctors have taken a 25% pay cut to help us tide over this situation. Similar thing has been done in other hospital groups and other companies. You would have read about Indigo. You would have read about Reliance, even giants like Reliance Group taking a pay cut. So when there is an impact on financials and cash flows, some of these mitigation steps are explored. We have also done to navigate through the pandemic, taking a pay cut, asking our landlords, people who own the hospital buildings, to delay the rental, defer the rentals, or reduce the rentals, asking our equipment manufacturers like say Siemens or GE or Philips to waive off annual maintenance contracts or delay those. So we have all tried this, and across our hospitals, there we have tried it. But here also, please keep in mind the larger hospital groups, like all of us, would have a shared advantage over smaller nursing homes and standalone hospitals. So they have a double whammy. First of all, they don't have a cash flow backup to help them survive through 6 or 7 months. Secondly, their vendors and suppliers are going to be tough with them because these smaller hospitals or nursing homes got no bargaining leverage. So this is the impact that hospitals, not only large groups, but nursing homes and smaller groups also suffered. And finally, all of this leads to huge stress on our people. We have had examples where our frontline nurses and technicians have been told by their parents and family members to stop working. But thankfully, in our system, we have been able to sort of counsel people to ensure that nobody leaves. But we have also come across, all of us would have read in papers enough stories about healthcare workers quitting jobs. Like I said earlier, when every bed in the country is required, we have instances of hospitals closing down. And where every healthcare worker in the country is required, we have instances of nurses and technicians quitting out of fear or out of family pressures. There are stresses on people, hospital administrators, for example, who manages the cash flows, who manages the suppliers, and all the stress of that. Severe stress on doctors who are treating COVID patients. Severe stress on non-COVID areas, for example. Enough examples of people who came in without any COVID symptom but have turned out to be COVID positive during the course of treatment, affecting a whole lot of health hospital staff, treating surgeons, treating doctors, nurses, and technicians falling sick, and of course the cost of doing all this. We have maybe a few hundred of our people who have been infected, not only in the hospitals but in the corporate office, in maintenance, in IT. Similar is the examples with most other hospitals. So the stress on our people in a already stressful environment, that already we are talking about the fear factor, the cash flow issues, the worries about the jobs, then the stress about working in hospitals, that which is unique to the healthcare sector, because no other sector is required to deal with COVID. An airline or a hospitality is not mandated or required to deal with patients of COVID. But in a healthcare environment, we have the additional responsibility of needing to deal with COVID patients. And that is where, as an HR group, that you would have faced issues. That how do you motivate your team, not only the HR team, the larger team, to carry on in the situation where we don't see an immediate light at the end of the tunnel. How do we as a HR leaders, people responsible to keep the morale up, people responsible to motivate the team, how do we carry on? And what is the messaging that we are able to do? Because even if we secure the cash, we secure the creditors, secure moratorium from the banks, if our people are not willing to carry on, if our people are fearful of multiple issues, then how do we as HR team lead them on? How do we as HR team give them the confidence that we are doing the right thing by continuing to treat people? So, and some of the examples that we have done in the Manipal system is getting what we call an emotional first aid. That when our colleagues actually fall sick, our nurses and doctors fall sick. Instances are there. We have what we call an emotional first aid support, where people talk to them about what is to be expected during the course of the treatment, what they would feel. How do we counsel them about worries about their own family in the circumstances, and reassuring them that we would be taking care of the families. We have had uh, our HR colleagues talking to parents of nurses and technicians in four languages. Many of our technicians and nurses would be from 4 or 5 states. So, say from Kerala, from Tamil Nadu, from Andhra Pradesh, from Karnataka. So we have had actually people talking to parents in the mother tongue. We have had people calling up, say, a nurse who's from Kerala, talking to her parents in Malayalam to explain what is she doing and how it is important that he or she carries on doing this work, and also giving them the confidence that we are there to take care and support. But then this is an instance where the HR is at the forefront of handling the pandemic. While the clinical work is done by our doctors and nurses, and they would try their best, holding the people together along with the leadership is something which is significantly where HR has to step up. And there are many instances where the HR teams across hospitals have actually gone beyond the call of duty and came up with novel ideas to handle the situation. So that's the final point on the context. And if you look at what the future could hold, we are still several months away from a vaccine, maybe years away from a vaccine being available to the last person in the country. The pandemic is there the virus is there to stay with us like many other viruses. There are very rare instances of eradicating a virus. Maybe smallpox is an example. We talk about polio being eradicated, but there are very limited examples of a virus being eradicated. So I guess it's a virus that we need to live with. Uh, so what does it mean when this pandemic is there in the community? What does it mean for healthcare and hospitals? What structural changes could come? One, what we have seen is people talk about teleconsultations and video consultations actually becoming an option. We have about 10% of our consultations actually happening through these systems at this point. But we are not sure, as a tertiary or a quaternary kind of a hospital group, whether that is a way forward, whether that structural change would happen. People talk about single speciality being maybe emerging as a way out as we progress. People who used to come to, say, a Manipal or a care multi-speciality hospital for a childbirth or for an ophthalmology treatment or for a joint replacement, whether they would now go to standalone hospital doing only this, that is again a structural change that people would talk about. But then if this happens, obviously there is an impact for people like us, what it means in terms of the growth potential of the enterprise. If the patient behavior changes, if the insurance behavior changes, if the price control is here to stay, if the government intervention is going to be more on a continuing basis, what does it mean for growth of healthcare? Healthcare delivery is something we need to ponder. And what happens to investments? A lot of investment in the country. Like I said, government's role right now is limited. They spend about 1.2% of the GDP. Most of it goes for salaries and recurring expenditure. But creation of infrastructure in the healthcare sector over the last decade or so have come from private capital, whether it is from private equity firms or whether it is from individual hospital entrepreneurs who have created these enterprises. The creation of additional capacity, creation of technology, uh, educating or bringing the talent back to the country or creating talent, all of this has happened from mostly from the private capital. So if the structural changes happen or the industry dynamics change, if it becomes too regulated, would the private capital continue to come? After all, private capital is a for-profit capital, for a reasonable return kind of a capital. If that is not going to be ensured, would we be able to continue to attract private investment into the sector? If it does not happen, then what? Nothing may be visible in the next 3 or 5 years, but 10 years later, when we look back, would we see that hospital beds are not growing? Even now, India's hospital bed numbers are way below world average, right? We have some 1.5 bed per thousand population compared to 4 or 5 in most other countries at the minimum. Our bed capacity is not getting created. New technology is not coming in. So if private capital is not available, would we find that when we look back after 5 years, that this pandemic has actually hampered the sector? Contrary to, like I'm repeating myself, contrary to the public perception that pandemics fuel growth in the healthcare sector, would we actually see when we reflect after 5 years that this pandemic has actually depleted the sector of investment, of people, of talent, and whether that would make us more vulnerable uh, when a second such incident happens, maybe 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Finally, what I want to conclude with is in the last 100 years, maybe in the first 80 years, there are very limited instances of this kind of pandemics happening. But in the last 20 years, we would learn more about it when Dr. Somraju talks about it. But in the last 20 years, we had SARS, we have MERS, H1N1, and now COVID. So it is no longer a remote possibility that more such novel viruses, novel diseases would come, highly infectious diseases would come. So then, as a country, are we prepared? Is the sector prepared? And once we navigate this pandemic, how do we translate those learnings into handling the issues which would arise in future? And whether the way we handle the current pandemic would would deplete the sector instead of growing the sector, whether it would discourage new investments or whether it would encourage new investment. So that is something we should reflect on. And I think it is equally important for HR colleagues to understand that the structure of the industry that we are working in is should be of equal concern to you, because that is what would impact people and in turn HR as we go forward.